Hi, I'm Anna Humphrey, and I am a senior at T.C. Williams High School in Alexandria, Virginia. And I'm known a little bit for being a space nerd. I really love exoplanets, which are planets that orbit other stars. And a lot of people ask me when I introduce myself and they hear about some of the research that I've done. I've spent the last 3 years researching exoplanets and whether we might be able to find more planets around other stars. They asked me, did you have a telescope when you were younger? Were you one of those kids that would like look up at the stars and, you know, obsessed with being an astronaut from like age 3 or something? What's interesting is that I wasn't. When I was younger, I wasn't a science nerd. I didn't love science, and I didn't dislike it. But it wasn't something that really caught my eye. I'd rather go out and kick the soccer ball for a few hours than play with the chemistry sets or the telescope that my parents provided to me because, you know, they wanted to make sure I had every opportunity to find what I was passionate about. And I think it's because science hadn't become real for me yet. It was something that was an area of content, you know, the same way that, you know, history might be an area, or history can be an area of content, or math can be an area of content. It was something that you learned and then, you know, you remembered for a test and then promptly forgot as soon as school ended in June. Not something that could be real and something you could use to interact with your community. And I think that changed my 7th grade year. I had a really fantastic 7th grade biology teacher named Mary Breslin, and she instead of standing at the front of the room and lecturing us in science, she taught us the scientific method. That was like the first thing we learned. And then when we started our environmental science unit, instead of, once again, just lecturing us, she sort of flipped the roles. She told us to use the scientific method and you go out in our community and find an environmental issue. And through the science fair, actually study that issue, collect data. And so she told us to do real science and then come back and teach our peers what we had learned about our own environment. We're talking neighborhood parks, local streams, our own backyards, things that were very, very real to us. And using science, so we learned that you could use science to explore our communities. But we didn't just stop there. After we did that research, we all presented to our class. And then we came back and we took a vote on which project we wanted to continue as a class. And I'd been researching wetlands and the wetlands' ability to remove bacteria from streams, an issue that is especially prevalent here in the area. In Alexandria, we have a lot of combined sewer outflows. It's also a problem in DC, so bacteria contamination in water is a local issue. And my class chose to use my data as the basis for a community action project. And so we called it our Change Project. And based on my research, we used science to plan and write a grant and ultimately implement the restoration of a local wetland. And so over the course of the year, we went from not really even knowing what real science looked like, the process of inquiry and learning and solving a problem, to using scientific principles to not only discover an issue in our community, but actually go all the way through the problem-solving process and have a tangible impact on our local community. And that was really powerful for me because I'd always been interested in helping my community, and I'd been a little bit of like an environmental activist when I was younger. But that was the first time that I realized that science was such a powerful tool, that you could use science to have that impact. And that's when the switch got flipped for me, and I knew that I loved science.
I've got to jump in on that one. Because there's been a lot of change. Even since you were in 7th grade, there's really been a lot of changes in the way that we teach science and the way people are realizing to teach science. And the thing that you said that really caught my ear was that originally you thought science was like a body of knowledge, a number of things that you needed to learn and then forget about when June rolled around. And what you learned instead is that science is actually something that you do.
Yes, exactly. It's a verb.
And it's a verb.
Not a noun.
Exactly right. And that's really a big change that's happened. you know, you were very fortunate. You know, your parents provided you with,
Yes.
with tools and capability, and you had a teacher. And I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who can point to the teacher that made a difference. You know, that sort of pointed that out to them. People who've become successful in science, you know, can do that as well. For me, it was my 6th grade teacher, not my 7th grade teacher. And it was a big event, and she sat me down after school and just sort of laid out what it was going to be. And I actually got to be 40 before it occurred to me that Mrs. Kennedy, you know, that I might need to reconsider what she told me it was going to do. But so, you know, so this is role of the teacher, but this issue of actually doing something and having a problem, having a question, a phenomena, something that you see, and learning how to ask the questions and collect the data and make an argument and present the evidence is something that I think increasingly we're trying to help students learn as a way of doing it, and not just people who are particularly talented or, you know, who really have the passion early. But I think the change that I've seen happen in the last decade maybe is a realization that every kid, every student needs to have an understanding of science just to be able to function, you know, just to be able to have that approach so that you can be a responsible citizen and, you know, and, oh yeah, by the way, maybe get a good job too. But but just to, you know, to deal with the issues that everyone needs to be dealing with today. Everybody's got to sort of get that perspective that science is a verb, and it's a way of going about it, and it's a way of demanding evidence and, you know, supporting a conclusion that is, I think, is increasingly important to the way that we're going to live. So I'll be quiet.
Know a little something about doing science.
Yeah.
And teaching kids to do it.
I'm Shawn Lowe. I teach at T.C. Williams High School. I teach physics and independent science research. And I didn't have a strong science program growing up. I didn't have a teacher who really brought any of that out. And there were times where I were in schools that were just so boring. My parents bribed me to go to school. They're like, just go to school for a month without complaint, and you can take a day off and go anywhere. And so I'd be like, let's go to the zoo. Let's go to the nature center. Let's go on this ecological walk. Let's go to a museum. And so when I graduated, so I went to Reed College, which has a lot of inquiry. And it was the first time I got to see science as a verb, science as action. And yet I didn't have that background of skills as, you know, the child. My parents weren't scientists. I didn't have the skills to go on. I didn't know what I needed to go on in science. I was the first woman in my family to graduate college. So I went to science education, and I looked at science museums, and I started my career there, and I looked at being a prairie naturalist, and I started my own business giving science demonstrations before I realized I really wanted those day-to-day connections with kids, and not little aha moments, but to really grow into something big. And so I went back to learn what are some research-based ways to teach physics so that it's accessible to everybody. How do we make science accessible to those who are traditionally left out? And give them that entryway and that knowledge that it's not just memorize this and move on, but how do you ask questions, how do you build, how do you move with the information? Which is what I love about the science research class, is it gives me that opportunity to be like, well, what do you want to study? Okay, great, what's your problem? Let's talk about your problem. Let's learn about it. How do you learn about it? How do you ask questions? Just write an email. You have to write an email. Go email that person. Blindly? Yes. And my students get a response probably every other email, whereas I don't get that from my colleagues. I'm lucky to give a response of like 1 out of 5 emails sent from my colleagues, which is really amazing.
That's really quite remarkable, actually. You know, to hear your trajectory is really interesting. I think, you know, sort of coming from not being connected at all to then sort of moving into it and moving into the educational side of it. And this, I mean, folks like you make an enormous difference for people. You know, from my great wisdom and long experience, you know, I was convinced from my younger 2 sons in particular that, you know, my generation and before had been sort of the time of physics. I was a mathematician originally, and so I tried to convince my boys that, you know, they were moving into a generation where biology is really important. I mean, you just sort of take a look at all the amazing things that are happening in biology right now, and they really should do that. Biology teacher was terrible, and the biology program basically consisted of learn everything in this book, and then we'll give you another one just like this that you can have at home. And so they weren't very thrilled, but their physics teacher was a star, and you know, and so I couldn't dissuade them. You know, one of them works at the Applied Physics Lab at Johns Hopkins, and the other has a PhD in astrophysics. And so much for your influence as parents, but teachers, on the other hand, you know, that's where the action is. I think
my biology teacher was dull and taught from the book, and my physics teacher was amazing and dynamic. And I went to college wanting to be a biophysics major because I had done so much biology growing up that I still loved it. But then when it came time to be in the classroom, it was like, biology is storytelling. I want to teach people how to think. Yeah, I want to be creative with that.
I think there's a certain amount of storytelling too, though. You know,
so much.
You know, you can capture so much of science, the history of science, or where we're going, by telling stories. And you know, stories are what help people get motivated. I think
there are some fabulous teachers out there who are storytellers. I just happen not to be a storyteller. I don't mind telling stories. I do tell stories, but I like. Okay, let's do this. What do you see? What's going on? Let's ask some more questions. Let's build a model out of this.
Yeah, well, I think there's also like a storytelling aspect to the actual experience of doing science. I think that's like one thing I always think about when I go to present the research that I've done is I always tell myself to, like, whatever you do, just tell your story about the research that you've done. And it really is a personal story as much as a research story as well, because you're going through, and as you learn to do research, science is hard. You're learning you're learning brand new things that maybe you don't know, but maybe literally no one knows them. And so that's when you're wandering into the unknown, it's difficult, and there's a lot of trials and challenges that you have to overcome. And I think that one of the a scientist who's really effective at communicating and is one that can sort of articulate not just how they came up with their idea, but all the challenges and all the different things, the trial and error they had to go through to make the breakthrough that ultimately led to the knowledge that was worth sharing with everyone. And I think that that's underappreciated.
I think you're right, and I think scientists, we don't train scientists very well to do that, I'm afraid. You know, when you read science papers, if you were to think of them from a journalistic perspective, scientists tend to bury the lead. You know, you'll get a long story, a long lot of detail and elaboration until you finally get to the end, or you finally get to a discussion, you finally get to the conclusion. And yet the people who are really effective science communicators aren't afraid to say what it is, and then make the case. But we sort of, I feel like there are students that I've had in the past that I should probably go back and apologize to. It took me a long time to realize some of these things, and I've talked to other teachers who feel the same way. They go, oh my goodness, if I just figured that out a little bit earlier, those poor students that I had then.
Definitely something we talk about in science research is if you don't understand the paper and you've read it a couple of times, you've looked up the words and all of that, it's probably just badly written.
Yes.
So let's just go back and do it again together.
Exactly right. It's about, but there's that doing it again. It's about doing it that I think really makes a big difference.
Definitely. I think that's also another underappreciated aspect of science. It's just how many, you have to build a very strong foundation of skills before you can even start doing the research, which I think is tough, why a lot of people are so intimidated by research, because they're like, oh, well, I have this question, like I'm really curious about exoplanets, or I'm really curious about sleep cycles, or about, how plants grow best. And they have this question, but they have absolutely no idea where to get started, because you have to learn how to learn. And, we spend so much time in school, but we're not learning how to learn, we're learning content, and there's a difference. And I think that one of the things that really, in taking science research class, one of the things that I really gained was learning how to identify what I needed to teach myself to get to the next layer of the question that I was trying to answer. Learn how to keep a notebook so that I could keep track of my questions and what I'd learned. Learning how to read journal articles so that I can access whole new areas of information, and not just read them, but also critique them, so that I'm growing in my own thinking, which once again helps me better answer in the question that I'm interested in. And there's a lot of skills that you really need support to help build, because they're hard to identify that you need to know these skills before you can really get started in the research. So,
but I think a lot of the, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, a lot of times I think students believe, students all the way up to graduate school believe, if I just take this class first, then I'll be better, and then I'll be able to answer this question. And yet, if you just jump in with the question, it comes so much quicker, because it's much more interesting. You're only learning what you want to learn. And then you're like, oh, I need to learn this too now, and it
Right.
just kind of gathers
There's
it.
a reason for it. It's not
Yes.
just because your teacher or your professor said you've got to learn this so you'll be able to do that. It's like, here's your question. Here's what you need to figure. Well, what do I need to know to do this next thing? And then you, along the way, you acquire those skills. You learn the skills that you need to do the thing that you need to do to work on that question. I think you're exactly right. Learning those skills in the context of something that you actually care about.
Yes.
So your example of the wetlands work, for
Yes.
example, you were an environmentalist first before you were a scientist. You
Yes,
cared about
exactly.
what was happening in the water there, and you learned the skills that you needed to kind of get at those questions because there was something in mind that you wanted to do. And I'm afraid so much science education has been of the other flavor, of the learn all these things first and then kind of flavor. And on my really optimistic days, I feel like we're beginning to turn that a little bit. I think we are, and I think I get to interact with a lot of science teachers, and I feel like there really is a change that's happening now, where that's become much more common for teachers to realize that. And I think for a lot of teachers, it's kind of scary, to just have a student pose a problem, and it might not be something that you actually know much about.
It takes a lot to just be like, wow, I am not going to know what you're talking about at all.
Right.
But if you can't explain it to me, neither do you.
Right.
So
we can figure out where to go, and I
Yeah.
can help you ask those questions or frame
Right.
those questions in a way that you can go start learning about it. I think that's a
yeah.
important lesson we're
I think
learning.
there's a couple of different things that are making that happen. One, I'm actually really excited that Virginia's cut back on the number of SOL testing, because I think there gets to be this immense pressure to teach to the test, which if you're doing good teaching and you're teaching thinking, you can just cram for the test at the end, because as long as you're covering the content and know your standards.
Right.
But the other thing is that there's so much data available, and I think for a lot of teachers, just learning how to use that data and say, okay, now we learned a little bit about the wetlands, now what data is out there for you to gather? What data can you work with? And mimicking the process of science, which makes then the next thing you go into, you can start to see that process. And it makes all the learning go a little faster.
I think so. So where next? I mean, so you've had a successful science career since you were in 7th grade. So what's next for someone like you?
Well, I have lots of questions that still need to be answered, so I will be chasing down those questions when I head off to college. I've been researching. I mentioned briefly earlier that I've been learning a lot and doing a lot of research on exoplanets. Specifically, I've been looking at planets where you have multiple planets around a single star, and I've been really interested in taking the planets that we know about and the data that we have, and seeing what we can do to unlock the possibility of planets that we've missed in those same systems. And I've been using an approach that's been, so I've been focusing on like gravitational stability of the system. So gravity, the same thing that keeps us down on Earth, is also the thing that pulls planets together. And so by studying how far apart planets are, and you can start to understand, could you inject another planet in between two that we've already found, and can it stay there without pulling too much on its neighbors, or will it start pulling on its neighbors and changing their orbits in a way that's not sustainable? So these sort of questions of like the interactions between planets has been something that's been very interesting to me, but largely not only because of the potential for finding additional planets, but also because I think it tells a powerful story about solar systems in general, and including our own. I think there's a lot we don't understand about our own solar system, and I'm very curious about what can other systems tell us about ourselves.
That's great. So what about your other students?
Oh, I have so many amazing students. And it all depends on what skills they bring to the table, but I watch them all grow. And so over the course of the year, they study. I've got one student who really wanted to know how lack of sleep affected her ability to do her schoolwork. And so she spent the year looking at fruit flies, and now she's designed an experiment, and she wrote this grant, and she's applied for a different grant so she could get Fitbits, so she could have kids wear them. And I've got somebody else who's really interested in being a chemical engineer, and she wanted to start with how to make a hydrogen fuel efficient, but then she wanted to look at how to make the hydrogen container efficient. And there's been a lot of struggle as she learns how to read the literature and ask questions and be brave. And so we've got this whole spectrum of kids with different levels, but I watch them when they finish the year and they're all ready to go to college and go up to a professor and say, I want to work in your lab.
That's incredible. It really is. You know, there was another thing that you just said there that rang a bell for me. You know, there's a lot of popular talk these days about STEM education, you know, not just science or math or anything. But, you know, that process that you just described there with the student with the fuel cell and the hydrogen and then the container for the hydrogen, you know, in my experience as a scientist now, as much as being an educator, is that that's sort of what the process of science is all about. You know, in my mind right now, the idea that STEM education is something new, I don't think it would be very new to many practicing scientists, because I found that the things that I needed to measure to understand the things that I wanted to understand in the ocean, in my case, I found that there weren't instruments that would measure the things I needed to measure. So I had to build the instruments to measure the things. Exactly the same story as your student building a character.
End up being engineering projects, and engineering projects
inform, because you need, that's where you get the data to answer your question, and they play back and forth. And so I think a lot of the, you know, the separations between the different disciplines we have in science, and and you know, science is really different from engineering, and you know, we're going to teach different subjects, and we're going to give you different math course if you're going to be an engineer or whether you're going to be a scientist. It just drives me crazy because it's really all about understanding the way the world works, and you know, being able to build a model of it that has some real predictive capability and helps you and builds that understanding, and so that connection between science and engineering is one that I'd personally like to figure out a way to beat it down. I would delighted to hear. I mean, a story like that is so typical of the way the world actually works, and yet I think for a lot of people, they don't understand that. They don't, you know, an engineer is one sort of thing, you know, and a scientist is something else, and there's something that they're doing that I can't understand or shouldn't be able to understand, and that's the barrier I'd like to knock down. I'd like to see how we do that.
I've actually thinking about for my physics class for next year how to rewrite every essential question, both as a scientist and then as an engineer, so that there's like asking them at the same time, so they can see the different approach and like pick whichever one you want to answer. Because it's the same thing. It's just exactly how you frame it and how you step into it.
Right. Yeah. And if you really want to build an understanding, you're probably going to need both of those.
Right. Right.
This is why I think like having the question-based learning, where it's a question that the student is personally interested in, is so powerful. I mean, I've taken science research for 3 years now. I've seen so many students is interested in so many different things go through the program, and every single student comes out with this, like you were saying, with the skills they need to go start at a lab freshman year. And I think that no matter where they started, and it doesn't mean that everyone is going out and competing in national science fairs, but maybe they're going and they've turned their project into a teaching resource and they're teaching students on the basis of their research, or they're working with a local organization to implement their research. And I think that because when you have a path of learning that's driven by a question, it frees up the student to take those different paths, you know, and to take an engineering approach, and then the next year to take a more scientific approach, or to combine the two, because we know the line can be pretty thin between the two. And do what they need to do, and then come out with the skills they need to continue to be successful in the future. And it's all because it was something that they were interested in, and it wasn't defined by the boundaries of content, it was defined by the boundaries of what they needed to learn to accomplish their goals.
Right.
I think another important part of the conversation is failure, and I think that's one of the hardest, the hardest things. And you know, just the idea that you were going to fail many, many times. And early in the second year that I had the science research program, I had a student who went to the International Science Fair and took second place, and he had no results, none at all. He'd been working at the Naval Research Lab. He'd been doing all this really high-tech stuff, and what he presented was the 2 different recipes for carbon nanotubes and to make them conductive, because his overarching goal was to get to carbon nanotube computers. And so he talked about the different recipes that were available, and how some of them were more linear and some of them were more conductive, and what it might take to get one in the middle that would get everything that they wanted. Shocked me, shocked his mentor at NRL that he took second place, and that idea that like, oh, just tell the story of how you do good science, because that's all people really care about. And you have no results? Psh, Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Just tell about all those problems you did solve, because you didn't get to your problem yet.
Right.
But you don't have a decade. You're not a professor
Right, exactly.
in a university.
Right.
But you did all these other little experiments and little engineering projects. So tell about those.
Yeah, and it's all about what you've learned. I mean, and that's really even scientific papers. You read papers, and oftentimes they don't actually get to whatever the thing was that somebody had in mind when they started. It's just how far I got right now. You know, this is sort of what I've learned. This is where I started, and this was the question, and then this was the question that came from that question. This is the one I had to answer before that. This is the one before I had that. Oh, I got something on that. I'll write that one up, and I would. I don't think I have this quantitatively, but I'll bet that's the overwhelming fraction of of published papers. It really is. It's all sort of that process of trying to understand it, and I am completely convinced that every kid has that ability to do that. I mean, maybe not at the very highest levels, and I'm not saying everybody is exactly the same, but you know, you look at little kids and they are just curious. You know, they want to know, why is it wet under the rock? Where did that thing go when it crawled away? Why does it grow? I mean, there's so many puzzles and things to figure out just in their own local environment, and yet, sadly, we seem to sort of squish it out of them by trying to say, well, if you really want to know why it's wet under the rock, come back in 5th grade, because we will have told you enough of that. You will have learned enough stuff by then that you can, we can discuss that question. And so those are changes I think we really need to make. I love the sound of your program. I wish every kid, had 4 years of science that looked like that.
Yes.
Yes. And and we'll learn the biology that you need to answer that question if that's what you're asking, and you'll understand enough about the way the physical world works so that biology question you have, is amenable to being approached, and that's sort of my fantasy at this point. we have a ways to go before we get there, I think.
But even if teachers can incorporate 1 or 2 short, open-ended experiments a year, right? You can baby steps. And I think about, at Reed College, they had all the set labs in the first quarter, and the second quarter was like, okay, what experiment do you want to do? We'll provide the equipment.
That's scary.
And it was terrifying. I had no idea how to ask that kind of a question.
Right.
I had no idea how to apply that knowledge. And so I would team up with other people who had better ideas and slowly learn to ask those questions. But how do you give teachers that opportunity to say, you know what, just once, you pick your favorite unit. What do you like most? What can we do that's open-ended, that the kids can come up with an answer?
Or come up with a question. Even.
Yeah.
To be able, I always figured with my graduate students that I knew a student was ready to really begin a PhD project when it was her question that she was beating me up with, as opposed to something that I had thought about. I'm serious, to have a question that you care about so much that you just plain have to do it, and it doesn't matter what your professor had to say. At that point, you're actually ready to do the work and go out in the world. And the fact that kids have an opportunity to get that beginning, a taste of that experience in high school, I think it's just super valuable.
I think it's life-changing.
It really is.
Yeah.
For all aspects of your life.
It definitely is.
Yeah. I mean, I would imagine that your experience probably extends a little bit outside of your lab too.
Lab?
Or your workspace.
I question that because I don't think there are any boundaries whatsoever. It's constantly turning in the back of my mind, my research. So, everywhere is my lab.
but do you think the way that you approach your research is the way you approach other things you need to deal with? Do you think there's any carryover there?
I think that the things that I've learned as a researcher have made me a better person. I think that is definitely something that I can say is true. I think that you mentioned a little earlier about learning how to fail. That has been such a huge part of my journey the last few years. Because I'm a perfectionist and I really like getting things right the first time. And you just can't do that. That just doesn't happen. And you learn a lot about how, like you were saying earlier, how to judge yourself based on the little goals that you've accomplished and all the little experiments that you've done, and not just sort of like whether or not you got to the end goal. And you learn to be proud of your own personal development and not compare yourself to the people around you. And you learn to persist even when you are really feeling down about the work you've done. And I think, we write reflections in research class, and I found that to be incredibly important because it forces you to take a moment and appreciate, hey, look at all the things I've learned, and even though I didn't get to where I wanted to be, I did get through all of these other challenges, and look at all the ways I've developed. And just as a person, I think that that's been really important for me too, because learning how to be comfortable with where you are and what you've done, and I think that that's something that it takes a while to really grow into, and I think that research has provided a fantastic arena for me to learn those life lessons.
I think that's incredible. Actually, I really do. What more could you say about why you should do this? And the real kind of personal benefits from having this particular way of looking at the world and posing a question and going after the things that are important for you.
It makes the world fun too.
Good.
when you care about questions and the curiosity and the passion, it makes everything a little more fun.
I think about one of the other motivating factors for me is there's so many kids that I've talked to who say, I want to do computer programming, I want to work in computers, and I'm like, great, what languages do you know? Spanish. Okay, so how do we do more career exploration here, now? If you are interested in this, the world is out there. Start, do science, do engineering, do computer programming, and see if you really like it before you go commit a year, 2 years of your college degree to realize
that's not really interesting.
English lit might be better, right? It can be very expensive.
And if you start with that, so what's your question? What's the code you want to write? What's the problem you want to solve? What's the thing you really like to know about? If you're interested in computer science, or what's the thing about that living system that you're curious about? Why do you want to do that? You start with that. What's your question? I think you've got a basis for really. Then right from the get-go, a student is engaged. You've got them hooked. Then it's their problem.
Exactly.